first element we are going to take a look at today is center of interest, which I think among the elements is one of the most self-explanatory, perhaps. One of the easier ones to understand. Am I right about that?
It can be, absolutely, but sometimes there are times when it's the most confusing to a juror as well, because an image will come up and sometimes a title will be read, and we'll talk about. I know we're going to be talking about titles here and there as we get going too, but when the image pops up in front of us, I'm like, what do they want us to look at? And that's really what center of interest is. It's the pointer points on the image where the maker wants us to go to and stop. And sometimes it's a subject, sometimes it's part of the story. It can be a lot of different things. And are we looking at this motorcycle together here today?
Yeah, the Black Knight. That's the first image we wanted to look at. Give me an example when you look at this image of how center of interest is defined in this image.
Yeah, in this particular image, it's really cool because you're drawn right to that bike, and in this case, like we mentioned, how the elements all work together. We're drawn to it because it's somewhat in the foreground. It's right there, blunt in our face. But then, as you start looking at it, you see how well it's shaped because of the lighting. And so we're seeing the dimensions of this motorcycle, but because of the light in the background and that light way off in the distance and some a little further in the distance, we're also getting depth. So composition is also leading us in a triangle from the behind that bike, to that center of interest. That maker's telling us exactly where to go, and we're stopping right at that subject matter as well.
Let's take a look at the next image. Hope emerging from the darkness. Now, when you look at this image, it's obvious the center of interest. But what I find interesting is that the center of interest is not in the center.
Yeah, that's kind of ironic, isn't it? It doesn't. That's not what it means, is to be center weighted or anything like that. In this particular case, yes, it's that color that's drawing us to it. That purple or violet, whatever you want to call it, aubergine, whatever you want to call the color. We're drawn to that, and we stay there. There's other little things that might lead us, that stem, things like that, but the color and light on that flower petal itself is what's drawing us to that center of interest, where that maker wanted us to go.
Talk a little bit about the stem, because I think that some people don't understand that having you can have other elements in your image that lead the eye to the center of interest, and that's what the stem does here.
Absolutely, and in this case, the center of interest is the subject matter itself. And so the subject has to tell the story. It also has to lead us, literally has to lead us to what the maker wants us to see. Now, we go there anyhow because of the color and the contrast of this, but it would also help even more if we follow on diagonals or curves. Those are things that we follow in our mind, our brain, when we look at a flat piece of paper or a screen. And verticals usually stop us. They're more stagnant. So things that run on an angle, like the stem, if it came up, had a little curve to it, or came in from one corner and brought us up to that center of interest, or that subject matter in this case, then it could be even more strong than what it is right now.
All right, so the last one's a little bit more tricky, and these are the kind that I really love when it comes to center of interest. This one is called the visitor, and let's talk about this one.
Well, and that's the story, and that's how these things are all coming together within this image. The visitor, we're seeing it because of contrast and color. We're going right to that cardinal up there. It's in a nice point of interest within composition, in a general rule of third kind of thought process. But then there's all kinds of supporting atmosphere, the woods and the shape and form of all these little trees and the depth of all the trees fighting off in the background. But we still go to that cardinal because of the contrast. So the maker used other parts, or the way we see contrast and composition, to draw us to their center of interest, which is the cardinal, the visitor.
So I'm going to hop in here now with a little tip that was said to me years ago, and I'm sure you've heard this tip as well. And if you're thinking about putting an image in for evaluation and you want to make sure your center of interest is good, one of the little things that you can do is to turn your image upside down, and then look away, glance back at your image. the first thing your eye sees, the first thing you lock onto, that's your center of interest. And if that's not what you want the judges to be looking at, then you've got a problem.
Make some changes.
That's
exactly.
Yeah, that's what they say. Like this image here with the cardinal, if you turned it upside down, when you came back and looked at it, your eye would still immediately be drawn to that little red bird.
Yes.
And so that everything in the image is pulling you there. Because we can look at our images for a long time sometimes, and we get lost in them, and we know what's important, and we forget that the person viewing it for the first time may not see it the way that we do. So in here, there's no doubt that little red bird stands out, even though it's so small on the page.
Absolutely. Well, think about marketing in general and what we see just walking around, the Nike emblem on a shirt. It's very small. But why do we see it? Because it's contrasted with the colors. They're using opposite colors or a contrast of black and white. And this is the same kind of thought process. It's a small, different color in an overall harmonizing field. And so we go to it. Can't help ourselves.